Burkina Faso's military junta has lifted a nationwide curfew it imposed after seizing power in a coup last month. This follows a revolt at several army barracks in the capital over then-President Roch Kabor's handling of jihadist attacks in the Sahel nation. Initially, the curfew was imposed from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., later being reduced to midnight to 4 a.m. before it was entirely lifted. President Cyril Ramaphosa is on a working visit to Mozambique at the invitation of President Filipe Nyusi. According to the United Nations COMTRADE database, South Africa's exports to Mozambique were $3.9 billion in 2020. Over 300 South African companies also operate in Mozambique. Well, for more on the relations between the two parties, we're joined by Political Economy Southern Africa Director Siya Beniza. Mr. Beniza, good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. In describing this visit and the relations between South Africa and Mozambique, part of what the presidency has said is that they're cordial, they're fraternal, and of a strategic nature. Does that fully encompass the relationship?
To some extent. Look, I think the relationship is complicated, to say the least, and that the countries, through different administrations and regimes, have had a very different kind of relationship. So obviously the ties geographically will always be there, given the proximity of the two countries, as well as the historical solidarity, given the struggle against colonialism and later apartheid in the case of South Africa. But if you look at the way in which the regimes over time have related to one another, the apartheid regime obviously, in its own interest, was trying to curb the spread of so-called communism, and has had a mixed history with Mozambique, given that it also funded competing liberation movements such as Renamo, etc., and was also involved in the tragic killing or death of the first democratically elected president in post-independence Mozambique, Machel. But given the fact that the history of the current regime under the Democratic South African, the ANC-led regime, has had this history through the liberation struggle, the relations have changed dramatically. And I think it's also this complex history that has made it quite difficult for Mozambique to be quite trusting in terms of accepting foreign assistance in dealing with the problem of the insurgents in Cabo Delgado.
And certainly when one looks at the ministers that are accompanying the president, you have the Deputy Minister of International Relations, but you also have the Deputy Minister of Defense there. Let's talk about that situation, because there seems to be, quite a lot beneath the surface in terms of the role that South Africa should play when it comes to assisting Mozambique, and some of the potential fallout is not the right word, but the tensions that have arisen elsewhere on the continent as a result of what should happen and how the response to this insurgency, what that response should be.
Look, I think it's firstly important to note that South African foreign policy with regards to Mozambique is, a far cry away from the former silent diplomacy in the way in which we dealt with our relations with Zimbabwe, for example. South Africa has been quite proactive in trying to assist in quelling the violence in Cabo Delgado, and obviously this visit is partly a visit for the commemoration of the passing of a former liberation stalwart, Eduardo Mondlane, but also a visit to Cabo Delgado in order to see the progress that the SADC mission in Mozambique, SAMIM, has actually been able to make since the deployment earlier this year. Obviously, South Africa contributed a strong part of the military contingent with assistance from other countries who are part of SADC, as well as Rwanda. And it wasn't until, I think, Rwanda's involvement that the military collective was able to take control of Cabo Delgado and push the insurgents backwards. So at this point, really, the countries are trying to maintain the stability in Cabo Delgado, but also to build, in terms of business confidence, to resume some of the natural gas projects. Obviously, Mozambique was a recipient over the last 3 or 4 years or so to some of the biggest amounts in terms of foreign investment, totaling around $60 billion that was invested in natural gas extraction in the northern parts, or in the Rovuma Basin, which is just off the coast of the northern parts of Mozambique. So a large part of this visit and the relations are about countries trying to find a way to continue rebuilding and maintaining stability in Cabo Delgado, but mainly trying to gain the confidence of business such that those projects, which had eventually been put on hold due to the conflicts, can resume once again.
It's one thing for countries to offer their support so that there is some level of stability that is restored to that area. But perhaps a bit more broadly, what are the interests that South Africa has in being vocal, in being visible when it comes to assuring investors that their money that has been put into exploring gas in that region is and will not be lost?
Look, I think South Africa has a very strong vested interest. You mentioned the trade ties, and the trade balance works in the favor of South Africa to the tune of around $2.4 billion in terms of that is the surplus exports that South Africa exports to Mozambique, and once you've subtracted what we import from the country. The country's trading profiles are pretty much similar in that we exchange raw mineral commodities, but one of the top 5 critical traded items is electricity or electrical current. Obviously, with South Africa facing severe electricity supply shortages, Mozambique, as one of its key source areas for electricity, is a critical partner. But more importantly, South Africa is trying to position itself in order to benefit as one of the key players in terms of upstream from the natural gas exploitation that's happening in the northern parts of Mozambique. Mozambique, obviously being less industrialized, will obviously try to gain advantage, take advantage of the natural gas to beneficiate some of that locally. And South Africa also has a vested interest in trying to see how to benefit upstream from that natural gas, as well as the existing trade ties around commodities, as well as the electricity or electrical current that we import from Mozambique.
All right, Director of Political Economy, Southern Africa, Siya Beniza. Let's leave it there. We also seem to be losing you a bit on that line.